Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line into the Russo-Ukrainian war. We have a multitude of updates in this video, so let's get straight into it. Starting out to the south of Donetsk, the Russians have managed to capture the village of Pobjeda, which translates into victory, so this is a Russian victory. They also managed to capture the fortifications to the north of the village in the forest lines, and with this the Russians are moving in a southern direction from Marinka and expanding their zone of control. The Russians will likely look to consolidate the gains here to the north and take advantage and develop the situation after the capture of Pobjeda to capture a buffer zone around the village before moving down in a southern direction where they will look to flank Novomikhailivka from the north. The village of Novomikhailivka has continuous fighting in this section of the front line, but there's been no developments over a few days to over a week now, and with this the Russians are looking to develop the situation or change the situation a little bit, because doing the same thing over and over again when it continues to fail is a stupid idea. So the Russians are looking to change the situation up, which would mean that they will need to gain further control over the northern parts to expand the zone of fighting and allow the Russians to advance on a wider front and attack from multiple directions. As such, they needed control over Pobjeda to secure the northern flank before they can manage to advance further. The main reason for that is that there is this supply route that goes through Pobjeda direction. It's a paved road, goes down to the eastern parts, the northern parts of these fortifications. Then there's the second one that goes through Pereskovivka. So with this, the Russians can now attack from the northern parts in a paved road towards Pereskovivka, which would cut off all the supplies to the northeastern parts, which would either force the Ukrainians to withdraw from these locations or launch counterattacks, which would drain up their forces, and the Russians can launch attacks towards the eastern positions when they are weakened, or simply cut off their supplies, which will allow them to again weaken the Ukrainian positions to the north of Novomikhailivka, and all of this adds up to the Russians advancing in the north. So the Russians are trying to expand their zone of control in the northern parts of Novomikhailivka, and with this they have managed to capture the village of Pobjeda and some surrounding fortifications, and this operation will continue until they have a strong enough flank to the north to start launching operations in the southern direction. Moving on to the Zaporizhia front, we see here that the Ukrainians managed to counterattack and regain control over the fortifications and trenches to the south of Robotyne. The fighting continues in the Robotyne direction, and the fighting is very heavy. I previously showed a picture of Robotyne where every single building is pretty much destroyed. There's nothing but rubble left. The same with Pobjeda, the same with the other frontline villages. There's pretty much nothing except for open fields in these areas, similar to the open fields besides them. This makes this battle very costly for both sides. The Russians are storming an area that is pretty much empty, which means that they're ample targets for artillery, but similarly the Ukrainians are holding these positions and counterattacking from these positions, which are completely open areas, which also makes them vulnerable to artillery. So whoever is using the most artillery in this section of the front line is likely to inflict more casualties, and with the Russian advantage in the amount of artillery they have available and how much they're shooting right now, the Russians would essentially grind down the Ukrainian forces faster and harder than the Ukrainians are grinding down the Russian forces. So the Russians have an interest in continuing this fight as long as possible, while at the same time forcing the Ukrainians to pour more reinforcements to this section of the front line. But it doesn't change the fact that the Ukrainians have managed to successfully counterattack and regain positions here to the south of Robotyne, which are these trenches and fortifications here to the south of Robotyne, which means that the Russians, if they want to recapture the village, need to yet again storm Ukrainian trenches, which makes it very difficult and is a very costly endeavor. However, they also have the ability to continue fighting from the western flank, which would cut off the supplies of the Ukrainians into the village. The interesting part about this section of the front line is the fortifications here are built by the Russians. So similarly to the Klishivka area, we will get back to that later, but essentially the trenches are all built in a northern direction, to the north of these forest lines. The same here to the west of the village, they are built on the northern parts. The reason for that is that they will have the forest lines to their back, which means that there's a lot of cover to the back, while in the front they would have a clear view of the northern direction. So with the Russians in control of these trenches to the west of Robotyne, they can see all of the Ukrainian positions to the north of it, while the Russians have control or lost control over the fortifications to the south of the village. The Ukrainians would have a poor visual over the southern parts because there's the forest line in between them. They still have an advantage with the control over the trenches, but it doesn't change the fact that the Ukrainians would have less of an advantage than the Russians would in the scenario of them holding their trenches. So the Russians holding a trench is more powerful than the Ukrainians holding the trench due to the nature of how it was built. Meanwhile, Deep State Map has also reported that the Ukrainians are withdrawing from this area here to the south of Robotyne, likely to conduct these counterattacks towards the fortifications and to prevent them from getting encircled from a pincer maneuver from the east and the west. The Ukrainians will likely fall back to some more defensible positions, as this fighting will likely drag on, as the Russians and the Ukrainians are fighting heavily over these locations here by Robotyne. The Russians are looking to regain control of it and push the Ukrainians back from the territory they gained here throughout the Ukrainian summer offensive. And the Ukrainians will try to hold on to it for as long as necessary for them to prepare for their next offensive here in this section of the front line. This is why they really wanted to hold on to the Slovakian line, their foothold across, as well as the position by Robotyne, as it will allow them to start pushing further in a southern direction in the future. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we take a look at the direction of Krynky, where the Russians have managed to advance towards the center of the village, leaving the Ukrainians with less control over the village, and the Ukrainians have been forced to go underground into the areas, the basements and other areas, fortifications within Krynky, to try and hold on for as long as possible. But it is reported that the Ukrainians are looking to withdraw from the area to redirect the 4th Marine Brigade from the Krynky direction and up to the Zaporizhzhia direction, where they're looking to strengthen the fortifications and the defense of the area in anticipation of a Russian offensive in the section of the front line. So with this, we see that there are further developments by the Russians in the Krynky direction. It is reported by Shoigu that the Ukrainians lost 3,500 Ukrainian soldiers in the operation by Krynky, but this is by the Russian Ministry of Defense, therefore it is an unreliable source, similar to how the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is also unreliable. This is mainly due to the fact that both sides have an interest in exaggerating the amount of losses, so we cannot say for sure that this is a true statement, as they have an interest in lying. Moving on to the Bakhmut direction to further explain the points about the fortifications, we take a look here at the fortifications to the southwest of Klishivka. We see here that it is formed in a half moon shape, where it pretty much has a massive area or wide angle to the south, where they can pretty much see everything to the south of their positions. If we take a look at the forest lines and so on, they can pretty much see everything here within this zone due to the nature of the fortifications. However, if they look in the northern direction, they would only be able to see this small part right here before the forest line simply disrupts their vision. So if the Ukrainians attack from the northern direction, then the fortifications would hardly have any value due to the limited sights of it, while if the Russians attack from a southern direction, they would be able to be seen from pretty much very far away. They would have to fight from the eastern direction, so pretty much you would need to gain control over Klishivka before attacking it. But this is also difficult because Klishivka is in the low grounds and this is on the high grounds. So the Ukrainians can simply pick up positions here by the forest lines and attack the Russian positions in Klishivka from the heights. Moving on to the next piece of news, there's continuous fighting in the Bakhmut direction as well as in the Avdiivka direction, but there's no significant developments. The same with Kreminna and Kupiansk. However, here to the south of Avdiivka, there was yesterday a strike on a concentration of Russian soldiers to the south of Donetsk. It is approximately 26 kilometers from the front line. Therefore, it is unlikely that it was artillery that launched this strike. What I believe launched the strike is this ammunition that is used for HIMARS. It is the M26 cluster munitions, and it was reported at some point in August of 2023 that it would be sent to Ukraine. However, there was no official confirmation, but then again, most of the military equipment that is sent to Ukraine goes around the official announcements until it has already arrived and so on, to give them the advantage of whether or not they know or not. Pretty much the M26 cluster munition are rockets that launch cluster strikes for a long distance, and it can be equipped with the HIMARS system. And as such, the Ukrainians can launch the cluster munition strikes at a distance of up to 70 kilometers, which puts this very far inside the range of the Ukrainian HIMARS systems. The main problem for the Russians here is that they had a general who is a very, to put it in a nice way, traditional to put it in a realistic way, extremely stupid. What he did was he lined up a company and was going to inspect them for whatever reason, traditional reason. He wants it to be active and blah, blah, whatever. The point is they lined them up. It was detected by the Ukrainians. They bombarded the location and pretty much an entire company was wiped out. That is the reality of the situation. You do not do these stupid moves so close to the front line. This is similar to what happened in Selidove, but in Selidove it was different. It was a much larger concentration, but they went outside lining up in a forest line. These Russian soldiers were standing in an open field right next to a forest line lined up. So the casualties here were pretty much all fatalities. Not a lot wounded because getting hit by cluster munitions while in the open field, not really the brightest thing a commander can do. So we see that both sides end up doing these strikes. Sometimes the Ukrainians make a mistake, sometimes the Russians make a mistake. But at this point, 2 years in, it's not a mistake anymore. It's just pure stupidity. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.